Welcome to Unexpected Points. I am your host, Kevin Cole, and I am joined, I would say a special guest, but okay, he's special now, but then he's going to be joining me every single week of the NFL season. Ryan Paganetti. Those people who know Ryan via Twitter, you can follow him at Paganetti Ryan. He joined the podcast a few weeks back. He is a former coach and game management specialist with the Eagles. So Ryan, first off, welcome. And I'm hoping you're gonna solve a few things for me here. So this is what I need you to solve for me here. The YouTube comments, they'll commonly say, number one, you never played the game, you know? So you check that box. You're gonna handle that for me. Number two, you're soft. You were a running back. Not only did you play the game, you were a running back. So that's a punishment, high intense position. So you have that for me. And you were a coach. So when we're criticizing coaches and they say, hey, why don't you become a head coach and figure these things out? Why don't you become a coach? Figure this out. You have the coaching angle. So I appreciate you coming on and handling all of that for me.
Yeah, I'm sure at some point I'll say some things and people are going to be like, this guy's in bad. He's just another one of you nerds or something. I'm sure I'll get classified there either way.
Yeah. You'll probably get the, well, now he's never getting back into the NFL with these takes.
Yeah.
With these, they'll come for you.
That's why he's not in the NFL. Exactly.
So they'll come for you no matter what. But at least we have that. I'm trying to help rebut some of these things on there. And so what we're going to do is, this is a Wednesday edition, but we're going to have Tuesday morning podcasts every week. Following up, we're going to review some of the stuff that went on the previous week. It's not going to be, your typical game by game sort of review. We're going to try to get into some things a little bit deeper, look at some things from a game management angle also, since that was one of your specialties when you're with the Eagles. You were on the headset with Doug Peterson discussing these things. And then we're going to do a little preview of the Thursday night games. The Thursday night schedule actually doesn't look as bad as I was thinking that sometimes it does this year. I think it helps when you have like Jags, Bengals, that you have now Joe Burrow and Trevor Lawrence this year. So there are going to be some interesting things to go into a little bit deeper on those previews and what we're looking for. But before we get into that, I want to quickly let everyone know, PFF, we have a promo code kickoff30 that is still in effect through September 13th. So anyone who's getting ready for a very late fantasy draft, anyone who's getting into the DFS season, anyone who wants to get all of the NFL and college information that we have available. First-time subscribers, you get 30% off with Kickoff 30 at PFF. I'm actually doing a draft tonight. So I'm very much on the late side on fantasy drafts. So of course we have rankings, not only from myself, but other fantasy analysts. And we're also gonna have some stuff on these showdown single game contests that I'm doing a lot of stuff for this season. All right. So let's get into the first thing I want to discuss now. Before we do a preview, we have nothing to review, right? So before we do a preview, I want to talk about kind of theoretically, when we're reviewing games, when you're looking back at what happened in a previous week, obviously there's like advanced scouting and other things that have gone on that you're very familiar with for being on the inside. What are you thinking about when you're watching a game and even reviewing a game? Like, what are the things that jump out to you, or do you have a system for how you would analyze these games?
Well, so if I was like, on the team side, looking at, maybe opportunities of like, okay, we're playing an upcoming opponent. In particular, like I take a really close look at like first and second downs. And I know there's been some research kind of suggesting, like third down production is somewhat random. Red zone's a little bit of a different situation. Like you obviously want to be good in those things, but from like a year to year basis, there's, it's sort of hard to be like predictive in those categories. Right. But, for the most part, these teams that are good on first and second down, or like are doing interesting things in first and second down, like year over year, there's some consistency there. And even like game over game. So for me, like just like watching a game in particular, like if it's Dallas versus Tampa tomorrow night, like I'm looking at like how effective those teams are on those like normal situations. And, like how often are they in like 2nd and 10s? How often are they in 2nd and 2s? Like how are they when they're in 2nd and 10? Are they just like running the ball and bringing up a 3rd and 8? Like, but in general, just like sort of getting a feel for like, how effective they are on those downs. And realistically, in my opinion, and just based off the data that I've seen, like the teams that are generally avoiding third down because they're so impressive on first and second down, like those are the teams that, are impressive to me. And those are the teams like over the course of the season that are going to score a lot of points and be very good offenses. And even and on the same thing on defensively, just are they getting teams to third down, even if they give up some conversions, like are they at least getting them in situations where it's 3rd and 6 and 3rd and 7s? And, over the course of the season, they're going to win more often than not on those. But, maybe on an individual game basis, they might, give up 4 for 4 on 3rd and 7+. But over the course of the season, like they're going to get a lot of stops there.
Yeah, yeah. No, the third down thing is something that's come up a lot. I think it's one of like many different things when you think about it. Like there's a higher degree of randomness, yet being able to identify players or quarterbacks or teams who can convert on a higher than average level is also important, right? You don't want to just assume that Patrick Mahomes is going to regress back to your league average type of conversion rate on that sort of thing. Well, it's interesting, when you mentioned that, the thing that I thought about is how much do you think teams think about like in-house in a way, like their own offense in that sort of way? I mean, famously, I don't want to bring up too much of like the Eagles every 2 seconds, right? But Carson Wentz 2017 was one of the examples that a lot of people point to when they say someone who had this absurd conversion rate, the EPA per play and success on third down, which was supposed to be a signal, a flashing signal to the fact that could have more trouble in the future. Do you think that's something that like offensive coordinators would also look at in their own offense and maybe, temper expectations or be more positive going forward, depending upon where they've come out on the luck on those different situations? Or is it tough as a coach to do that? Is it more like a coach, hey, we need to just execute and not worry about whether things are going to regress or not?
Yeah, I think that always to me was such a significant concern that it's like our third down production, even like 3rd and long, we were like off the charts. Yeah. I think we were number 1 in 2017 and like red zone efficiency as well. And obviously, I'm familiar with the research done in the past. I think Football Outsiders has done a lot of good stuff on this, like historically. And I'm like, look, we were sort of average on 1st and 2nd downs. And, like that's something where if we can, like year over year, I was trying to emphasize, like, if we can, be one of the best teams at 1st and 2nd downs, we're going to be hard to beat. Like, and that's going to be something like, game over game, week over week, like we're going to be a good offense. And we tried to like focus on that. And we unfortunately, like, we sort of even took a step back on 1st and 2nd downs, in addition to the regression on 3rd downs, the regression on red zone. So it was kind of like a nightmare scenario from that standpoint. But I think one thing that, a lot of coaches that I've sort of talked to get a little caught up with is like, they realize that 3rd downs in red zone are so important in like an individual game. And I think they, almost overemphasize being good in those categories. Just because realistically, they do have a disproportional impact on like an individual game outcome, but on like a season outcome, it's to me the 1st and 2nd down effectiveness that you really would want to be focused on. And sort of like, it was a sort of a challenge for me at times, like communicating that it's like, okay, cool, we were good at 3rd downs last year, but like, it's going to be hard to be as good on 3rd downs this year. And, like there was room for improvement on 1st and 2nd down, and realistically the Saints or the Chiefs or New England, like these teams, year in or year out that are good on offense, like they're always excellent on those downs. And that's really where we want to focus. And I think even just like the way that teams are orienting their practice schedules, like you have most teams around the league from my, background of what I've seen and what I've heard is like, if they have 3 days of practice, like it'll be Wednesday will be 1st and 2nd downs. Thursday will be something like, 3rd downs, 4th downs, short yardage situations. And then Friday might be like a red zone day or 2-minute day, like some combination. And I almost think you should just spend way more time on 1st and 2nd downs and like make sure your game plan is on the money there, because if you're like solid there, like you're going to be a good team. But it's almost like it's getting weighted as like 1/3 of the importance of the game. But realistically, like your red zone offense doesn't matter if you're not getting there, or like you might practice all this 3rd down stuff, but like you don't even want to be in 3rd and 8+ or 3rd and 12s and things like that. You'd like to not even be in. I mean, you look at the best like offensive performances recently, like they're not even getting to 3rd downs. But I think, just sort of factoring in like, okay, last game we went 5 for 5 in the red zone. That's great. But like being aware of the fact that like that's unlikely to continue is always important. And because realistically, if you get two of those red zone drives as touchdowns, I mean, that's a huge gap in points over the course of an individual game. But realistically, the red zone like efficiency around the league is not, it's not 100%. It's not even 80%. It's not 70%. So like you should anticipate that even if you're like an excellent team, you're not hitting those numbers. Just being aware of it. Like, I mean, you'll see teams win games sometimes and they go, 3 of 3 in the red zone, but then a team loses and they went, 2 of 6 in the red zone. Well, I want to be the team that got in the red zone 6 times for like future games, obviously. So those are some things that I kind of think about.
Yeah. I remember doing a quick little data study on, this is going to seem like ancient history because of the perception shift here, but people may remember that Marcus Mariota was one of these guys who had this like really insane red zone efficiency. His first, I don't know, maybe 3 years of his career or something like that. So, I just did a really easy data study where I just compiled every other quarterback going back to guys who were drafted, I think after 2000 or later, said, let's look at their first 3 seasons, how well they performed in the red zone. And then let's just go ahead and plot that out against how well they performed over roughly the same number of dropbacks. Let's say like 1,000 dropbacks, their next 1,000 dropbacks. And, there's like no correlation basically between how efficient those guys are. So yeah, I mean, I think the tension is, and this is probably like a thematic thing that we're going to talk about a lot when reviewing games. The tension is on one side, you have what affects outcomes, right? So turnovers, third down, how well you play on third down, like red zone efficiency, penalties, sometimes these big penalties. So you have like things that can really have a high level where if you're just going to, plot one thing versus wins, versus point differential, however you want to do it, those are going to be extremely important. But you don't have your ability to affect those things, your ability to control those things. They're very, very random at the same point in time. So I think that's probably like the in the risk reward, let's say the opportunity cost that you're talking about, what are you going to spend time on? I mean, coaches are just going to be constantly like harping on whether or not a running back that fumbles, let's say, or something like that, or even pull running backs from games if they're fumbling, when there's just a high degree of randomness to it. It's extreme. I mean, it's a hugely negative play, right? But there's an extreme degree of randomness to it. So I think that's probably really important. And a lot of the stats that I compile afterwards is saying, like you said, third down conversions, how well is the team doing versus what you think, fumbling, special teams, sometimes like how well a team's doing in special teams versus that, penalties, all these sorts of things go into an adjustment that you can make to say, how well did a team play versus, trying to discount some of the randomness out of that number.
Yeah, I'd say the one thing I'd say about fumbles is, I know people like to talk about, what went on with New England and all that, but
yeah,
I think to some degree, the fumble frequency can be explained, not lost fumbles, but the fumble frequency can be somewhat explained by, coaching emphasis on the players. In terms of like managing risk, like one thing that makes me want to just like lose my mind when I'm watching a game is like, say a receiver rips off a big catch and they're going towards the goal line and it's clearly going to be a first down and they like reach the ball out to like get the ball over. And it's like, guess what? Like, you're taking such an outrageous chance of like fumbling this ball and it going out of the back of the end zone and it being a turnover, when if it's first and goal from the half yard line, the expected points of the offense is like nearly certain to get a touchdown. And it's just like I think there's certain emphasis of like, okay, it's first and second downs, like our running backs are like, are they securing the ball? Like, is the quarterback from an interception standpoint, like why are some quarterbacks taking like ridiculous risks on first and second down in the first half of a game, as opposed to the guys that are, throwing to receivers that are pretty clearly open? It's like, now once the plays, that you're sort of behind the sticks, or like the magnitude's a little bit greater, it's like third down or fourth down and, a turnover doesn't really matter as much. Like I can understand like ramping up the risk and stuff, but when you see, quarterbacks being like super aggressive, trying to fit balls in like tight windows or making risky throws on first and second downs, I'm like, that's something that New England never has done for like 20 years. And I know, I think Brady was like talking about something recently about just sort of like really and I think he just sort of gets underrated from the standpoint of like managing risk and managing the game. And, maybe his absolute yards per attempt or rate stats are never going to be the highest, but in terms of avoiding mistakes, I mean, he's like your game management expert on the field. And,
Yeah.
and the total number of mistakes he's had in like 20 years is probably like, you can probably count on like two hands. So I look at that, like if it's tomorrow night and you see Dak Prescott trying to like rip a ball in there and like it's getting knocked down by a linebacker, or it's like, a contested ball on 1st and 10 in the first quarter. Like, I'm like, those are chances you don't want your quarterback taking. If that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, I always think like how it's being communicated, I think is somewhat important. I mean, so another thing, like other data studies that I've done, and I think it's like you mentioned about Brady, he and Peyton Manning also, like I've done some things where I've plotted, INT rate versus what the win probability is at a particular time. So both of those guys have a very logical trend there where they're throwing more interceptions when their win probability is lower, and vice versa, as opposed to, I remember there was this data study that got some play around about Jameis Winston and the fact that he was throwing a lot of interceptions on low expected points plays. But the problem was that field position wasn't accounted for in that. So I think he was like just throwing a lot of interceptions near his own end zone, which is not like on first down, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that he's not doing a first down. And I plotted him and he's just like completely flat. Like he just throws interceptions at the same rate, no matter what the situation is, no matter who's going on. So it's having those sort of smart things. But when you're communicating that to a player, because like a nerd would say like, oh, you could be like in basketball where Daryl Morey or whoever would sit down with Shane Battier and he would just absorb all of this crap. Or you could sit down with a player and say, see, like expected points, or obviously you're not going to necessarily do that. But if you just tell them, don't do something stupid, like reach the ball over the goal line. I mean, it's very cool to dive into the end zone and like put it over the goal line. Like these guys have this instinct. So like, I always wonder that part of like, can it be effective to actually use these analytical concepts to communicate? Or is it better just to hit these like broader themes of don't do something dumb, basically?
I think you just have to sort of develop a standard and like a culture, and it's got to come from like the top down, whether that's your head coach, and just be like, look, this is how we play football. And I don't care how much money you make or what your name is. Like, this is what for example, this is what the Patriots do. This is our way of doing things. And if you don't do this, like, you're not going to play. I don't care if you make a lot of money. I don't care if you're a first round pick. And I actually remember like I had somebody, I think, who had either worked in New England or at Alabama, or they had crossed paths with some people, with New England people. And they had said that there was like a saying going around in New England that was effectively something like, the fate of everyone in the organization, including their children, is dependent on you not fumbling that ball.
Yeah.
And like just basically like threatening them that like children aren't gonna be able to eat food because you're gonna get employees fired if you are reckless and fumble the ball. And I think also just like in terms of your like roster allocation, like if you have these, high paid running backs and they fumble, well, you're clearly still going to play them. But I think when you don't have like high paid running backs, or like maybe the receiver group is not, paid a ton of money and those guys make mistakes, well, like, okay, you can theoretically punish them and like make a point. Like I know New England in the past, like they've had guys, fumble and maybe they get deactivated for the next game or something, or they sort of lose their spot in the rotation temporarily and kind of have to earn it back. But I think just having some level of punishment, as opposed to some other teams, like they might have a running back making $12 million a year and he fumbles and like he's going to be out there the next drive. Like you're not going to like, and then other players on the team see that and they're like, well, whatever, like he's fumbled, nothing happened. And I think it sort of sets the tone for the whole team. It's kind of an interesting philosophy, but yeah, like this like threat and like this like perception to like really, and it really is true. Like, I mean, if you're, part of an organization and maybe you're like an equipment intern and the team is fumbling at a very high rate, like, every single employee in that building is at risk of like losing their job. Theoretically,
yeah.
It's an interesting way of like capturing the magnitude of it and trying to like make it feel real for the players.
No. Okay. I think part of my displeasure when I see these guys being pulled if they're fumbling too much, part of it is like fantasy football. I'll admit, like, there's nothing that tilts fantasy football players more than like back in the day, Stephen Ridley would fumble and then they take him out of the game and they would put in LeGarrette Blount or someone and everyone would just be going insane. Or I remember this first round pick, David Wilson, who played for Tom Coughlin for the Giants, and he like fumbled the first or second play of his rookie season. And it's basically like you never saw him again the entire rest of the time. And people got really upset about that. But what I do think is interesting when we're talking about watching, like what perspective you get from watching a game when it comes to fumbling, and you can get some of this from data too, is different types of fumbles are different too, right? Like you mentioned receivers, those are often going to be the costliest fumble because if that receiver is not recovering his own fumble, normally the proportion of defenders surrounding him versus his own offensive players is very, very high. So you're going to lose a lot of those. A running back next, especially if they're breaking something downfield. But if they're they're close to the line, at least there are offensive linemen and other people being there. And a quarterback, I remember even for QBR for when they do the statistic at ESPN and they calculate that the value. Like they try to make it as if a fumble, when you recover your own fumble, a team recovers its own fumble, it's weighted just as heavily as having lost it. But they do make an exception for a fumble that the quarterback recovers himself, because often those are kind of like little muffed plays where you're just recovering your own fumble. So I do think there is context with fumbles also as far as how dangerous they are.
Yeah, the shotgun snap fumbles, in my opinion, are a huge thing that sort of jacks up the fumble rates and like fumble conversion, like recovery percentages and things like that. Because a lot of times, it's just a bad snap. Maybe it touches the ground or something, and the quarterback jumps on it or grabs it and just throws it away. And like in general, like I wouldn't be like overly worried about those. Like obviously you want your center and like the quarterback to be on the same page, but it's really the ones where you got like receivers and backs being like fairly reckless with the ball that kind of are concerning. Or another one that like is kind of crazy to me is like it's first and goal at the 1 and you run like a running back dive play and they jump over and try to reach it over and it's like boom, pop the ball out. And we would coach our linebackers like, if you see that ball get like any sort of air, like attempt to reach the ball over, like go punch that thing, like because that's such a massive win probability and expected points change if you can knock that ball out. Now, if it's third or fourth down, like that's a different story on the goal line. Go ahead and jump over, reach over, do whatever. Like you'd see the Drew Brees quarterback sneak on the goal line that he's done all this so many times, where like he would just jump and like reach the ball over the top. And that's usually would only occur though on like say like third or fourth down or whatever. But it's sort of an interesting deal. And like I think it's funny, like everyone said on New England, like the balls are fixed, like they're going to start fumbling at a high rate, and then they just like continued to have a very low rate. And it's like, okay, well maybe they're doing something besides for that.
Yeah, that went the analysis on that went back and forth, and I think the final conclusion was probably they weren't doing anything because nothing had changed. And the numbers, I think there was a lot of stuff included in there, like special teams and other things that maybe shouldn't have been included in initial data studies that were saying that they were doing something. Although I like to think that they were doing something, because
I think it's so easy for everyone in the league to just assume that the team that is the best over long periods must be doing something. That's unfair. But I also agree. Like I think it's very marginal. And I've actually heard of players like juicing up the balls up way above the PSI. Like some of these quarterbacks apparently like that, and no one says anything. But like I don't think it's really that big of a deal. Like it was just an excuse to say why New England was winning.
Yeah. And I think the biggest factor in those types of like a reason to have skepticism whenever you see anything like that is like if you have enough teams over enough period of time, like if you have enough subsets of teams, let's look at like 3-year windows or whatever they're looking at, of enough teams over enough period of time, you have hundreds of 3-year windows. Someone is going to be fumbling way more often than someone else, and someone's going to be fumbling very little, just if it was completely random and you were just randomly assigning fumbles to different teams. That's another thing to think about maybe when you're looking at these big analyses. Okay, so we mentioned the third down stuff. You had this fumble tangent. Is there anything else that you look at? I thought about penalties, but again, that's another one of the things where it's probably hard to figure out what's discipline, what's bad luck. Especially when we come to things like a defensive pass interference, which could be massive swings. Some of them look like they're almost 50-50, ball. They say 50-50 balls, but even those are probably not really 50% chance of being caught in a lot of these circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, I think to some degree, if you're evaluating like individual players' performances or quarterback's performance. Like I do think you'd probably want to, even though that like the scorekeepers aren't granting those yards on like DPIs and things like that, I think, if you're on like the team side, you would almost want to like give credit to a receiver who created a DPI, or give credit to a quarterback that threw a ball that ended up with a DPI in terms of like predictive value going forward. But I think to me, just like, or particularly like tomorrow night, like just seeing how the game is sort of officiated from like, no one really knows, like, are they going to be calling holding? Are they going to be doing this? Like, are these certain points of emphasis going to actually happen? And then I like to just keep up on a little bit of like the, general concepts that seem to be something that, could give you a little bit of an edge. Like, all right, are these teams throwing the ball a lot on first down early on in the game? Are they running a lot of play action? Like, are they using a lot of shifts and motion? And like, I know there was some work done recently on like motion at the snap, and that was like an interesting concept that I think more and more teams are trying to implement, because there is a pretty compelling amount of data supporting that those plays are sort of generating more expected points in the run game and the pass game. And so I just kind of look for some of these like creative things that maybe are a little bit like analytics friendly that might be happening early on in the game. And then I almost don't worry too much about later on game stuff, and that's more when I kind of look at like game management type situations, rather than a lot of times the later on in the game you're just dealing with like managing the score, whether you're winning or losing, and acting accordingly from like a schematic standpoint. So that's just sort of how I look at it, I guess.
Yeah. The penalties thing is interesting. I mean, this is totally anecdotal. I should probably have crunched numbers before saying something like this, but it seemed to me like the first week or two of the preseason, there were a ton of holding calls, and then they were leveling off. And I think that's kind of like a common phenomenon. Last year, early in the season, holding penalties were way, way down. And that probably contributed to this scoring explosion that we saw, where like if you looked in the betting markets, overs were hitting consistently all the time because teams were scoring so many points. This year, I think that's something like holding generally is something to pay attention to. This year, I think the rule change where it's basically outside of the, it's outside of the tackle box and within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. There's this new rule where offensive blockers and those who are taking on blocks cannot go low anymore. So the thought, initially the thought was, this is bad because you're thinking about it from a blocker's perspective. They can't go out and cut guys. But now the thought is, and I think this is really interesting to see, is like maybe if you're running these wide zone runs or screen passes, the defensive backs, they can't go low on these blockers anymore. Like, how are they going to deal with a guard coming out there who, it could make it actually very, very difficult. And those plays may you may see more explosive plays there where you can't just neutralize a block and at least get in the player's way if you're a defensive back on that. So I think that's an interesting rule change to watch that could have big ramifications.
Yeah, I think there's been ups and downs, but these like crack toss concepts where these teams have like basically, wide receivers or tight ends just block down hard, and then they pull maybe like two guys, and it's two offensive linemen like running full steam ahead, and theoretically like they're either engaging linebackers or safeties or corners. And those matchups are tough to win, when you have a 100+ pound weight disadvantage. So just at least dive bombing in there and like slowing it up or like setting an edge was helpful, and I don't know if they'll be able to do that anymore, so that might be interesting to keep an eye out on.
Yeah. I think it'll be interesting just to see like the percentage of explosive run plays, if that starts to tick up a little bit. Because that's always been like the real like differentiator, right? Between like the success rates may be roughly equal between running and passing, but you just don't have the upside with the upside when you run the ball as versus when you pass the ball. So if that starts to level out a little bit, of course, we're not going to be on here claiming for exotic smash mouths for every team, but it could have a little bit of effect this year. Okay, so we're going to transition here to talking about the Thursday night game. But before we do that, we will talk about some fantasy and betting angles there. So I want to tell you guys about Fantrax. Those who may have watched, we did a fantasy football draft with Fantrax amongst the PFF fantasy team. It's a new platform that's available, super easy to use, and it has potential to put salaries in there, contract options, generate unique scoring systems. And of course, you can go ahead and import all of your league information from another platform straight into Fantrax. And now you can get a free account, promo code PFF at fantrax.com/PFF. You have a chance to win a trip to a regular season game of your choice for your entire league, plus $6,000. So go ahead and go to promo code PFF at fantrax.com/PFF. And another sponsor we have is DraftKings. So DraftKings, not only do we have the fantasy side of things that everyone knows about DraftKings, but in quite a few states now, we also have their sports betting and their sports book available. The NFL is back. Get in on the action before opening night kicks off. There's a no-brainer offer here. The sports book has moved the spread of Tampa Bay plus 73 for all customers. That's pretty, I guess they've gone from -8 to plus 73. So that sounds pretty strong. That means you still cash in as long as the reigning champs don't lose by 74 points against Dallas. I'm not going to crunch the numbers on this, but I'm going to say that's a pretty small chance of happening. So if you haven't tried DraftKings yet, don't miss out. $200 in free bets instantly when you bet $1 more on any football game. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app now. Use promo code PFFBET, so PFFBET. New customers bet $1 in any football game, receive $200 in free bets instantly with promo code PFFBET. Must be 21 or older in New Jersey, Indiana, or Pennsylvania only. Bet free promotion for new customers only. Minimum $5 deposit. Max wager limits apply. One per customer. Restrictions apply. See DraftKings.com/sportsbook for details. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER or in Indiana, 1-800-9-WITH-IT. With all that, now you know where to go for all of your betting needs. Let's talk about this Thursday night game. So I'm going to talk a little bit just up top. We're talking about some of the betting stuff, and mostly because it's information. So I think if anyone is discussing this game and doesn't have context of the fact that the Bucs are an 8-point favorite, which I looked at the games last season in 2020, this would put it about the 15th percentile for being the biggest spread. So this is not a close game by historical standards where people may be thinking about it a different way. So if you're not thinking about that, if you're not thinking about the fact that the implied totals for what teams are going to score, Tampa Bay is about 29.75 points. Dallas is 21.75. So there's a big gap there between that and how much the teams will score. So I think that's all important stuff to think about up top. Now, what I want to dub this, and this is actually going to bring up our frenemy, Josh Hermsmeyer, on this. He was very famous, and I just assume people know about all these Twitter nonsense conversations, but he was famous for a couple of years ago, or infamous, I should say. A couple of years ago, he talked about quote unquote defenses don't matter. Now, I know that's probably going to hurt as a former defensive coach to hear that, but the theory was when he was modeling for offensive outcomes, which defense a particular player was facing did not show up as being significant enough where if he was going to try to have a very parsimonious small model, it didn't really affect things. So I think this game in particular is a good test subject on defenses mattering, because you have two offenses who are strong offenses, probably two quarterbacks who people consider to be top 5, maybe Dak being on the cusp of top 5. But yet you have two defenses. You have one, Tampa Bay, who was 5th in EPA per play on defense last year, performing even better down the stretch. Dallas was surprisingly 20th. I thought they'd be even worse in EPA per play, but I think they were just so bad to start the season that people didn't really pay attention to the fact that they got a little bit better to end the season, but they had no offense going forward. So I'm going to put this to you. Do defenses matter? Do we have to how are you thinking about the defenses in this game where you have a great defense who brought everyone back, right? They ran it back with bringing back all their different players versus a poor defense who shifted everything up, including the defensive coordinator, bringing in Dan Quinn. How do we think about what's going to happen in this type of matchup?
Well, one, I do think defenses matter, and I think
okay.
At the end of the day,
he's on record here. He's on record to say defenses matter.
I think sure, you can outscore other people at times and everything, but you're allocating between all your employees and players and stuff, like you're allocating like tens of thousands of hours on trying to stop other teams and things like that. And if you just like didn't spend that time, like Aaron Rodgers is going to spend, you look like Bishop Sycamore on defense, and like you just like the outcomes that you're seeing are, even though these defenses are doing everything possible to slow down these teams, some of these defenses are doing a great job. And I mean, even look at the Super Bowl, like Tampa did an outstanding job against Kansas City. And I just think in general, like, yes, you can be a fairly decent team, just scoring a ton of points and things like that. But, when it comes down to the actual playoffs, winning those close games against good teams, I mean, you have to have at least somewhat of a competent defense. And like how good that's a little bit debatable maybe, but, there's a reason like Belichick as a defensive coach is considered the best coach in NFL history. And I think you'll see even more like an emphasis on, these defensive coaches as these offenses continue to succeed. It's like maybe you see a little bit of a push towards more teams hiring defensive head coaches just to kind of come up with some kind of answers. Because like if you're playing Aaron Rodgers or Pat Mahomes and you just aren't good enough defensively, like it's the most like disheartening thing as a coaching staff, like or a team or an organization. Like you think of teams like the Raiders in recent years who actually like were pretty good on offense, and they just simply were nowhere near good enough to stop guys like Mahomes. And it's like, it doesn't matter if we score 38 because they're going to score 48. And it's tough for the whole organization, in my opinion. But I think in general, like the number for Dallas is a little bit misleading at 20 because for expected points per play, because they were struggling so badly in run defense that they were just facing a ton of runs. And obviously the average expected points on runs is lower. But but other teams are just incentivized to just continue to run the ball, which would bring that EPA per play from like a league-wide standpoint down, but they still weren't exactly slowing people down very much.
Yeah.
I think just the fact that Todd Bowles should be an NFL head coach. Like what he did last year in the last couple of years in Tampa was outstanding. I think, just being able to bring everyone back and having a communication standpoint, like having those guys all on the same page, defensively when you're dealing with things like shifts, motions, unusual alignments, stacks, like how are you passing off routes, like all that stuff I think is really critical. And like that, particularly with like, fitting up the run game or dealing with, more unique passing concepts. Like Kellen Moore is going to call some things that, they haven't seen. And like having your players have answers of like, okay, if number 3 goes across the formation, if number 2 goes across the formation, like if these guys, switch release, like just having everyone on the same page and having that veteran experience is very valuable. And that's where I would be concerned from Dallas's standpoint is like, just, are these guys going to be on the money in terms of like, you have so many new players, you have a brand new defensive coordinator, like it's just a lot easier when you get like year over year, if you have those guys that are experienced in the same system. I mean, I know Dallas is going to play some rookies as well. And there might be some ups and downs there from a mental standpoint or matching things up or like missed assignment standpoint. But I think, the continuity on defense, particularly when the guys are like talented, is very useful and important, particularly to just like avoid mental errors that could be like catastrophic, wide open 70-yard touchdowns, as opposed to you got a new coordinator, new players, the odds of something like that going wrong and, somebody just dropping Chris Godwin or whatever, Mike Evans, and it's a 65-yard touchdown because they didn't realize who was going to cover the post or whatever and cover 4, like stuff like that may have a higher chance of coming up when you have a new staff and new players.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, okay. So to go back to like the defense mattering thing for a second, I think it's one of these situations where you could make the argument that like quarterback play like determines so much of what's happening on offense that in a way, all these hours that you're talking about putting in, while it's going into defensive performance that's maybe a little bit, there's some more randomness there or more dependence upon who you're facing. In some ways, it could be more valuable because you are working with it's talent dependent. Don't get me wrong, but it's not just like a talent dependent on so much on one particular person, right? Where like, let's face it, offenses just are never going to have a ceiling unless they have that one particular quarterback who they need. And there's not much, like very little goes into that, right? You draft someone, hopefully, and they become that person basically. And then beyond that, you're developing them, you're doing this and that. But so everything that goes on the defensive end, there's a lot more figuring out how all the pieces go together, how the scheme goes together, everything else. How much of scheme are you thinking about in these types of matchups? In particular, this like the big thing, everyone is enamored and in love with Brandon Staley. You mentioned the new hot trend, which could happen with head coaches. So he's the guy who's been running a lot more too high types of defenses. It looks like, according to our numbers, a lot of cover 4 and cover 6. And Dan Quinn is more from the Seattle, lineage, which was more of your cover 3, cover 1. It looks like they ran some traditional like cover 2 stuff, but barely any of the cover 4 and cover 6 sort of stuff. So how do you think about that? Do you think this evolution is getting overhyped, or do you see why this might be the next thing in the NFL? And could that mean that someone like Quinn will have to adapt going forward?
I think so. I think having at least some of your scheme involved with the too high and cover 4, cover 6, like those concepts are really, effective in the league right now, in my opinion. And depending on how you're running them, I think there's, in particular, you see value with some of the things like cover 4 when there's like a running quarterback, because you can sort of get the safeties involved in the run defense. Because right now, if you're playing like a simple, single high post defense, and the quarterbacks are involved in the run game, like you have numbers issues. Like if you're a single gap defense and it's like, all right, are you having guys 2 gap? Are you having guys like do something with like the Vic Fangio, Brandon Staley type scheme where like maybe they're playing 1.5 gaps, which I think is like a really interesting concept that I need to personally look more into. But having just some kind of answer against the running quarterbacks, where you see so many of these quarterbacks that are pretty athletic and they can, make things happen. And really, if you're just sitting there and you're like stagnant, like post high defenses, like it can be tough. And even at times, just like the pass games are so good that you have these elite receivers out wide and it's like a cover 3 and, you're basically turning it into like a one-on-one situation for your outside corners. And so like the cover 4 and 6, like those can give those guys a lot more help. Like one thing we would do in Philly is like if we were playing like one really elite receiver, we would do like a lot of cover 6 where we would effectively like be playing man to the side of the elite receiver. So like that way we always had a safety over the top on that side. And then we play like cover 4 on the other side, if that makes sense. And like that was something that we felt like, basically gave us enough numbers to, slow down a top receiver if a corner needed it. But, it also allowed us to, play some zone on the other side and give a look that, maybe makes the other team run the ball a little bit more. And it was kind of an interesting like chess match of like, how are you dealing with that? Because in theory, like some of that, there are some issues with like some of those coverages as well. Like, cover 4, for example, like one way I'd be looking to attack that, depending on how the defense plays it, is like, going over the top with play action stuff and like the post route in particular, because you see a lot of times, realistically, like depending on how the number 2 and number 3 receiver to a side are running their routes, like those guys can basically occupy a safety to that side. So you sort of turn cover 4 into possibly like a cover 0 in some cases for the outside receiver and for the outside corner. And then so like if you have a guy that can run, you have a burner, like he's just, if you can take a shot at the post, whether that's like with a play action and the safety bites or you're just basically like draining the number 2 or number 3, you're basically draining the safety to that side. Like there's some opportunities there. And I think it's always going to be an interesting like chess match. And I think it's interesting with what, Coach Staley did last year and what, Coach Fangio has been doing. I've talked to some offensive coaches and you ask them like, who's the hardest defense to go against? And for a while, like everyone was saying Vic Fangio. Yeah. And I think he's proven that with like his, statistical performances of his defenses over the years. And I think you'll see some more copycat stuff. But at the same time, like, a guy like Dan Quinn, who has a very long history of playing defense a certain way. Like sometimes these guys are fairly resistant to change. And I think one thing you'll see even more of like coming forward is, teams just that have a certain identity as like a cover 3 team or a cover 4 team, and just being able to, mix in the other looks more frequently, and in theory, like run both looks from the same pre-snap alignment when possible, like try to disguise as long as possible pre-snap, because if you're going up against like Brady or an Aaron Rodgers, Mahomes, and like they know what you're in before the snap, like good luck. Like it's hard enough because they could figure it out real fast after the snap, but the longer you can hold off, and so they're not exactly sure what's going on, the better in terms of giving yourself a chance to get a stop.
Yeah, I mean, but that again sounds like something where if you have continuity, it makes things easier, right? Like
Yes,
the more things you put into motion, the more potential for disaster, essentially,
absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
if things are not going well. So yeah, I mean that'll be interesting to see whether or not the Cowboys defense can kind of hold up in this way. Do you think the fact that there was this big discussion on preseason, right? So we had a preseason, we had more of a traditional camp this year versus what we saw last year. And it was always tough to tease out, like, why was there this offensive explosion last year? Was it the lack of preseason? Was it the holding penalties? Was it some, extraordinary, the unknown that we can't even think of why it happened? Do you think any of that benefits the defense more than the offense, or is it really tough to say?
I think it's really tough as a defense to play a team that you have no idea what they're going to do.
Mm-hmm.
And like the more data you have, and like more snaps you see of like the identity of an offensive coordinator, or even like how that quarterback sort of plays and reads plays, like the easier it is to stop. And for me, like I always felt better as a defense, like it's the middle of the year and like how that offense operates. You really know their base run concepts, their base pass concepts, as opposed to like early on in the year, like you have no idea what's going to happen. So this game's a little bit different in the sense that, I think both teams have a good sense of like what sort of concepts Dallas will run on offense, what sort of concepts Tampa will run on offense for like their base stuff. But, every team kind of mixes in some wrinkles and things like that. But defensively, like no one really totally knows how Dan Quinn's going to do things. I'm sure, there definitely will be some overlap to what he was doing in Atlanta and Seattle. But, from Dallas's standpoint, they probably have a pretty good idea of, the general stuff that Todd Bowles is going to do. So I think there's a little bit of advantage from Dallas's standpoint as opposed to Tampa's a little bit wondering like, all right, what is Dan Quinn going to be doing defensively?
Yeah. Yeah. And then, just to go into some more details about kind of how the view has progressed on this game. I mean, this was something where, like I mentioned, the Bucs are an 8-point favorite. It opened in May at 6.5. So it's moved a 1.5. I think some of that is like Dak's shoulder questions that have gone on. Maybe a little bit of it is the fact that Zach Martin's going to be out, although not a whole lot. But I think there's also this component where people have just gotten more positive on the Bucs, maybe because they look good during the preseason and Brady looked good, all that sort of stuff. I don't know if you're that familiar with kind of like the new prospects that are coming to the league, this and that, but one guy that I'm interested to watch for the Cowboys is Micah Parsons, who was the first linebacker selected. Supposedly he's this guy that they may use in pass rush. They may use traditional, outside linebacker sort of stuff. What do you think about this, like linebacker chess piece sort of situation? Have you ever come across some of that in your time, and how difficult or valuable can it be to implement something like that? Because the linebacker position is one of these positions that's gotten beaten down at least a little bit as far as what people perceive the value is.
I think it'll be interesting. I would say, if he's, I don't know, is he going to primarily be like a middle linebacker or?
Yeah, I think he's being a middle linebacker, although he could be blitzing quite a bit. It depends on Quinn. Like Quinn traditionally is someone who didn't blitz a lot, right? But then the second half of last season, he did. The pass rush for the Cowboys is, I don't know. It's not like they have DeMarcus Lawrence and some other guys. It's okay, but this is something he's really good at, is attacking. So they may employ him in that way.
Yeah, I would say in general, like it would be kind of a unusual look to have like your middle linebacker frequently like lining up on the line of scrimmage and rushing on like say like typical plays. But if it's third down I'm sure like they could find some things to, get him up there or, blitz him from off the ball, or maybe it's, second and long and it's kind of like a situation where you can pass rush. Maybe there's some creative things that they do there. I mean, it'll be interesting to kind of see, like, I don't know. That's sort of a tough transition to be like an off ball guy and then simultaneously, be like a guy who can like put their hand down and rush. And like, it sounds like he's a genetic freak. So maybe he can do it.
Yeah.
But I think it'll be sort of interesting to kind of see how that goes. Can he win one-on-one against a tackle or guard or whatever it is? But I think just, from the place that I was, like, there was sort of a limited investment at the linebacker position. And so we didn't always have too many situations where we had guys that could, do something like that. I mean, there'd be times where guys would be blitzing or they'd be lined up on the line of scrimmage and rush, but to like basically turn them into like a full-time pass rusher on like, rush situations, that wasn't exactly something that, we were doing, but it'd be interesting. I don't know. We'll see.
Yeah, it'll be. Yeah, I'm interested to see him. I mean, I wrote an article earlier this year looking at him as potentially like a defensive rookie of the year type of guy. It's weird because I feel like he is a lot of ways like even a better prospect than guys we saw like Devin White and Devin Bush, who were much earlier picks, but there were so many offensive players who went this year that people weren't thinking about him. And, I kind of also like this idea of like the Cowboys defense will get better. So therefore he's like the main piece that they brought in. So therefore he'll get a lot of credit for the fact that the defense gets better. So I think that's kind of an interesting angle for this game. I guess I don't know. My overall point for this, I think it's a good matchup. I think maybe there's a lot built into people's expectations when it comes to Dak's shoulder, when it comes to the defenses, when it comes to everything else, that you have a lot of outs for Dallas keeping this closer than we're hoping for. And, we'll end up seeing what happens here. We have one more segment left to go, and I'm going to let Ryan discuss his game NFL breaking news strategy. I'm calling it a little bit on the Galaxy Brain side, but a lot of great ideas have come from started off in that as being seen that way. But before we talk about that, I want to talk about Western and Southern. In these uncertain times, life is full of questions like, when should I start thinking about life insurance? Ryan's probably not at that point yet. I may be, but however difficult these questions may be, Western and Southern can help you answer them. Backed by 130 years of experience, together we can leave the unknown behind. Western and Southern Financial Group, life insurance, retirement, and investments, compensated endorser, products issued by member companies of Western and Southern Financial Group, Cincinnati, Ohio. And lastly here, Manscaped is back. So it's fantasy football draft season is upon us. It's time to put the PP back in PPR league. I don't know who wrote these. With the sponsors of today's show, Manscaped. The leaders in below the waist grooming just launched the new Performance Package 4.0. That's right. Not 2.0, not 3.0, 4.0. Wow. Don't neglect your balls like the Packers front office has been neglecting Aaron Rodgers. Again, I did not write this. Join the 2 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for kickoff by going to manscaped.com for 20% off and free shipping with promo code PFF. This will help you tame that Troy Polamalu in your pants. This is getting better. Get 20% off and free shipping with promo code PFF at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping with promo code PFF at manscaped.com. If your significant other is nagging you about how much time you put into your fantasy team, you might as well gift them with some beautiful balls with Manscaped. Okay. Got through that. All right. So here we go, Ryan. I don't know if we can follow up that with something even better here. So I'm gonna give you the floor to discuss a theory. I don't know if you want me to set this up at all, but you've done some research this offseason and you're here to break the NFL. Give it to me.
Okay. First of all, I have to apologize to any kickers if I start costing people some jobs, because there is a chance that, some of these guys will not, if this actually got implemented frequently around the league, that some of these guys that, have low kick trajectories would have some trouble sticking around the NFL. But we're already costing running backs tons of money in the analytics community. So now we're coming for kickers. We're coming for you, kickers. Okay. So I've actually brought this up multiple times on like the team side of things, and I just got laughed at because it's like basically it sounds like a meme. And I just think it's funny because like I actually really strongly think that it's something that teams should be considering, and at the very least, like studying or having workouts and looking into this. And basically the idea is that when you actually take some of the data and see where the ball is and like the flight path of a ball on field goals, there's actually a chance that you could probably block like a fairly high percentage of field goal kicks if you had a certain player on your roster that was capable of getting very high up with like their height and their vertical. So this idea basically is that it's one of the great parts about this is there's more and more resources and like there's more data available now, as opposed to a few years ago, like when I was trying to basically promote this idea like internally, it was essentially like you're like no and in order to even like build a data set to do this, like you would have had to bring in kickers, you would have had to bring in like players that had never played football before and like experiment with all these things. But now really like the breakthrough to me is this company TrackMan, which does the Sunday Night Football broadcast. They do they have the ball, I believe it's Sunday Night Football, but they have the ball flight tracking, like using radar technology. And it's really awesome. Like they can tell you like the power behind the ball. They can tell you the apex of the flight. They can tell you that, how far the field goals would be good from. And when we would actually play on Sunday Night Football and I'm like up in the booth, like I would use the TrackMan information that was showing up on the broadcast and I would communicate that to our staff during the game. Because, for example, like they might, compile data on how far a certain kicker was kicking in pregame. And, maybe he was, the farthest he attempted was 53 in pregame. But, the TrackMan data was showing that his kicks would have been good from 61. Well, then that informs our defensive coordinator if he's like managing a situation at the end of a half or end of a game and like knowing, generally speaking, that the kicker is capable of kicking from that distance. Like it was very useful information that you otherwise really wouldn't have, and it would have just been a complete guess.
So this is wait, this is available pregame to take
no, well, so they compiled TrackMan for the Sunday Night Football games was like compiling this pregame, and then it might show up on the broadcast like, all right, pregame did this, or maybe like there was a kick in the first quarter that was a 48-yard kick, but instead it would have been good from 59. Well, like that information can be helpful and useful, and it certainly appears to be pretty accurate. And like the TrackMan technology is so exceptional that you have something like most of the PGA Tour players are actually have their own TrackMan device to track their flight of their ball when they're hitting on the practice range or hitting whenever they're doing sort of experiments with their game, because you can get so much good information, like are you fading, like is there draw, like where should you be aiming, like should you increase your loft, like there's such interesting stuff going on there. Well, anyways, like I personally would wish that the TrackMan technology was used in all stadiums and all broadcasts, because it's so interesting and so useful. And also for this strategy that I'm suggesting, it would be very helpful to have that information. But at this time, like that's not something that's going on. But if you were part of a broadcast team or a producer, like you should strongly consider, getting this implemented, because I think it's really interesting for the viewer. And at the same time, like from a team side, like I think it's really useful and helpful as well. But anyways, really the main idea that I have here is that I've taken a little bit of a look at some of the data in terms of, some of the TrackMan stuff that's not, current kickers, but guys that, like are currently not in the league, but maybe have used some of the TrackMan technology to sort of gather some data on this. And what's really interesting is you can sort of get a sense for like, okay, where is the ball located at the line of scrimmage, like on these field goal kicks? Where is the ball located above the line of scrimmage? Where's the ball located 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage? Like, where's the ball located 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage? Because on a typical field goal rush, like you do get a significant amount of penetration. Like most, field goal rushes, it might be getting an exact number. You might have to use some next gen stats to like determine what sort of penetration you can get on the, the field goal rush. But you're looking at something like 1+ yards of penetration on most field goal rushes. And
I guess the blockers are like in a very much like a bend don't break type of philosophy.
Yes. Yeah, and like the thinking is, so the ball is placed 8 yards behind the line of scrimmage on essentially every field goal. Like that's like the universal standard. And you see a lot of these field goal block attempts, like some of the strategies that are employed will include like double teaming, like a guard, for example. Like you might have 2 or 3 guys in there that are just driving back this guy as much as possible. And then at the kick point, you see these guys who are still relatively on the ground, or maybe they can get a few inches off the ground. They'll like reach their hands up and try to get a ball. And like some of these blocks that do occur, you know, it's because they get such penetration. Maybe they're 2 yards in the backfield or whatever. Mm-hmm. So, and this is where my strategy comes in. And I think it's really interesting in the sense that, you know, it would require like little to nothing to experiment with and to, you know, bring a guy in and work them out and like sort of gather some data on if this is feasible. But my argument is that when you actually look at where the balls are, if you take that situation where you say that you make an estimate that, okay, roughly on a typical field goal block, the rush gets roughly 1 yard of penetration. TrackMan and like these other technologies, like you can really know how far the ball is above the line of scrimmage at that point. And the median, you know, for like the NFL would roughly be something like 11.5 feet above the line of scrimmage at that point. And the average is maybe 11.5 feet, somewhere around that range for most kicks. Now, some guys are a little bit higher and a little bit lower. But, you know, most of the launch angles of the kicks are something around like 28, 29 degrees. And based off of that, you can sort of like build a projection, you know, based on roughly where are these field goals going to be at the line of scrimmage. Where are they going to be 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage? Where are they going to be 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage? And so my sort of argument is that that number is not particularly high. Like say, if you could consistently, you know, get a high jumping or tall person 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage and get them jumping as high as they can, that, you know, you could block a significant amount of these kicks. And what I actually think is if you had your defensive linemen not even really attempting to get their hands up, but just exclusively focusing on creating as much of a penetration of the guards and the tackles, and they really can't touch the centers. That's one of the rules in the NFL, is like you kind of just have to be lined up off the center. But, you know, just creating as much of a penetration where like hopefully you could get something like, you know, 1.5 to 2 yards of depth into the backfield. Well, at that point, if you were able to consistently do that, even to the point of, you know, 1 yard into the backfield, which is pretty standard around the league, then you could have a guy, particularly say take players that are super tall in the NBA, or take players that have just like exceptional verticals in the NBA that are also very tall. And like you could block a lot of these kicks, or at the very least, you know, like come close to blocking, or possibly deter some of these kickers or make them change their trajectory or change their launch angle, which I think could have some pretty significant implications. So I've done some research on these NBA players. I've done research on guys that maybe, you know, aren't good enough for the NBA, or maybe they're like a D League type guy. And it's sort of a benefit from this strategy standpoint that some of these like insanely tall guys are sort of phased out of the league, or they just, you know, they don't have like a market in the NBA because the league is so like free and athleticism oriented that, you know, just some of these guys, they play a few minutes, or maybe they're just developing in like the lower levels, and they're not really considered like an NBA guy anymore, as opposed to, you know, 15 years ago, these 7'2", 7'3" guys, like they had a role on an NBA team, and now they're sort of getting phased out. But because of that, the salaries that these guys are making are not particularly high. And like, I'm not sure if you could get some freak like Giannis making $40 million a year. I don't know if you could convince him to get involved in this, but just because of like, you're not gonna be able to pay him that much money.
Yeah.
And I don't even know if they ultimately have like the exact body type that you're looking for. But so based on those numbers that I was mentioning, okay, so you say roughly 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage, you have like a median field goal height at something like 11.5 feet, and an average field goal height at something 11.5 feet. And I have some numbers here that, you know, the 25th percentile of the field goal heights is something around, you know, like 10.9 feet. And the 75th percentile is something like 12 feet and like 3 inches in terms of like the distribution of where these kicks are. So I think you could actually get better than 1 yard behind the line of scrimmage if your defensive line was not attempting to block the kick and you only had one player that was really attempting to get vertical height. And those guys were just strictly trying to drive the offensive line back as far as they could. So, but based off that information, I look at this NBA combine information, and a few names like jump off. Some guys haven't done the combine testing, but some have done the testing. And the first name, in my opinion, that comes to mind, and I think this would be hilarious, and it would like fit well with like the meme concept of 2021, where you have Dogecoin and you have like GameStop and AMC. Like this is like basically a meme, and it's like something that, you know, guys sitting at a bar probably have like talked to each other about, and they're like, why don't you just put some ridiculously tall guy out there to block field goals? Well, I think with all these variables, like I think that strategy is very viable. So the name that to me stands out the most is this guy Taco Fall for the Celtics, who is he's 7'5" without shoes. I believe at the combine he tested 7'7" with shoes. His standing reach was 10 feet 2 inches, and then his maximum reach after his vertical was something like over 12 and a half feet or around 12 and a half feet. It's like, well, if he's able to get that sort of height, and the average, you know, height of the ball is far below that, like you all of a sudden are talking about a scenario where like he's in the range of like, even if he can get half of his typical vertical, like possibly blocking like a high percentage of these kicks. Like, and so a guy like Taco Fall, like he's on a very low contract in the NBA because, you know, players of his skill set and, you know, like these guys, it's sort of tough for them to get up and down the court and things like that. So I think he makes something like $600,000 a year in the NBA, and the minimum contract in the NFL exceeds that. And at the very least, like in my opinion, you could explore this situation and sort of try to gather some data of like, all right, if we did have our defensive line, you know, exclusively focused on penetrating, how much, you know, depth could we create in a typical scenario? You know, if Taco Fall's wearing, like if he's wearing like shoulder pads, if he's wearing a helmet, like you probably want to give him the smallest shoulder pads possible, or like the lightest gear in general, or like I'm sure you could screw around with even like how thick their shoes are, and like there's all sorts of variables you can mess around with. Like, okay, are there rules on like how big the gloves guys have? Like, because what if, you know, you had gloves that exceeded the length of their hand by like a couple extra inches, like, and like I don't know if there's currently rules about that in the NFL. Like maybe there is, maybe there isn't, maybe they'd have to employ some things, but you know, if you could consistently be getting, you know, reaches well over 12 feet from these guys, like they're going to be involved in the field goal block, and like they're going to be able to block kicks. And a guy like Taco Fall, like, you know, I don't know if he'd want to do it. You know, the other guy that I was looking at was like Boban, for, I think I don't even know what team he currently plays for, but he's something like 7'3", and he has like the biggest hands in the history of the NBA. And then even some of these other names of like guys that, you know, maybe are like super athletes, but they just don't currently have the skills to be like a significant contributor at the NBA level. And one name in particular that stood out to me was this guy named Jericho Sims. And I don't know his true talent level and things like that, but I think he was like the 57th pick in this most recent draft. And he's something like 6'10", and he had a 44-inch standing vertical, or like running vertical or whatever, but the absolute maximum reach that he hit was like over 12 and a half feet as well. And it's like, okay, well, will a player like that be more negatively impacted from like wearing, you know, football gear? Like probably. So like, I would guess that, you know, there's a more of a negative impact on the total height that they could reach.
Right.
But,
so the guys who are just purely tall, you don't have to worry about that.
But between tall and they have long arms, their absolute reach. Like,
right.
So I mean, Taco Fall without jumping, he's
10-2,
basically reaching 10-2 and like 10-3, whatever. And, you know, if he gets 12-inch vertical, which his vertical is something like 25 inches or whatever, if he gets half of his typical vertical, I mean, he's in the mix of blocking these things.
And so I guess some important context here. So, I mean, I'm not going to, okay. So number one, this is something that I'd ask you about, is that there's a perception that the trajectory changes a lot based upon how far the field goal is, but you found that that's not even necessarily the case, right? So you don't have more line drive, like significantly on average for every single kicker is not doing more long drives from longer distances versus being closer in?
Yeah, so I guess, from the data that I've seen, and I think you could kind of fine tune this, and maybe to some degree it exists, but like the launch angles are pretty consistent, and that the absolute like height the ball reaches, at the apex point of the kick, that might be impacted based off of the kick power. And maybe there's a small change in the angle, but a lot of these kickers, they want to be consistent and like kick consistently at a certain angle. And you might see some lower kicks in general because those guys are like really pushing it and really just trying to kick the ball as hard as possible because it's a 58-yard kick or whatever, and things like that. And they're almost less precise on their launch angle and things like that. But if anything, you would be more involved and more likely to block the longer kicks where there might be a slight decrease in the trajectory, as opposed to like something that's like a 25-yard field goal. I'm really interested, like to the point of like extra points. Like I would be very interested to see at that distance with most kicks, like could this be something that where that kicker gets, or where that blocking person gets involved? And there's a lot of names, like there's a lot of guys that, 7'1", 7'2", guys that are just, not NBA caliber guys that, maybe they're playing in Europe, or maybe they're just, developing, and maybe they have the ability to get involved and disrupt some of these plays. And maybe there's an opportunity to, get themselves on an NFL practice squad. And maybe it's like, okay, this week we think we're playing a team that, kicks the ball lower than average, or maybe you're playing Justin Tucker and you think that his launch angle is higher than average and the guy might not be able to be involved. But realistically, at the end of the day, this would be your last player on your active roster. So like whatever it is, 46 or 48 guys, and they could have an enormous impact on your ability to win or lose games because so many of these kicks have a large impact. And I think the most important thing, if you were on the team side, would be studying, how much actual depth into the line of scrimmage can you create with your rushes? And like what has been observed in the past, it might not be reflective of what actually could happen if those players were exclusively focused on creating this. Now, the other thing too is because of these rules with like jumping over the line of scrimmage and whatnot, the player would have to be aligned on the line of scrimmage to start, in terms of like them jumping high, because they technically, like if you start from behind the line of scrimmage, you can't like land on the line or it's a penalty. So there's a little bit of some things you kind of would have to hash out and sort of figure out, but I think it would be super interesting. And then theoretically, depending on what that player's skill set is, like you could cross train them a little bit to do something like, okay, like fades on the goal line, or like,
okay, I like it. Now we're going next level
maybe
here.
He has two plays, like he either runs a slant or he runs a fade, and just like, I don't know, it'd be interesting to think about, if it's an athletic guy, it's the end of the first half and the other team's throwing a Hail Mary from the 50-yard line. Well, a lot of offenses or a lot of defenses will sub in a guy like a receiver or something to go try to bat a ball down. Well, like if you have a guy who's 6'10" with a 44-inch vertical, like you'd want that guy on your Hail Mary defense for sure. I think there's all sorts of interesting things to think about there on, but either way, I just think it's something where like if you actually look at all the data, like there's a very compelling argument, particularly if you're gathering a little bit more data, that like, and even on the team side with like some of the, GPS tracking of where the actual offensive lineman and defensive lineman end up at the kick point. I think there's something there. And I think, if I was Bill Belichick right now, I'm calling Brad Stevens and being like, hey, can you bring your tall guys over here? Like, can we have a little like workout, like after practice on Friday, and just like see what this looks like? Because, Taco Fall is on the Celtics, and Belichick is, he's always invested in a ton of resources into special teams. And it could be something as easy as like, all right, well, Taco comes on Fridays, flies to games on Saturdays, and like, he's like a 3-day-a-week guy, and like we win.
He's like
games.
moonlighting as a NFL block kick specialist.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, so I like this. I mean, I think also good context is like field goals are so automatic now. So if you can block a material percentage of them, like it really changes the whole dynamic on how much these things are worth. Now, so a couple of things, devil's advocate sort of thing. So I think the recruiting aspect is interesting because, like you mentioned, I think at one point in time, it was like 10% of all the 7-foot tall people in the entire world were in the NBA. And of course, that's gone down as the importance here. So you have, you have some freaks out there who are looking for work. So I think that works well. I mean, you probably might be difficult to get like an NBA guy who can get drafted in the NBA to come over, but there are lots of options I'm sure we don't even know about. We just don't have the data on. So that's fine there. Okay. So looking at like secondary effects here, is there any concern that you cause the other team to go for it more often, like in these marginal to go sort of situations, and that whittles away some of your benefit because of that, or you cause them to go for two then more often?
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be a situation where like we'll deal with it when we get there. Like if it's first, let's see if it works.
Yeah.
And if it does, okay, and then it somehow like becomes not valuable because teams aren't attempting those things, then maybe you just don't have the player active. Like, but in the meantime, in the short term, with so many field goal kicks, so many extra points, I mean, the percentage of games that are won or lost by margins of like 3 or less is so high. And really trying to guess like what percentage of kicks you could block, that's where I don't have an answer. Like I don't know, but it makes me think, if this guy's absolute reach exceeds, the 75th percentile, like is the jumping reach exceeds the 75th percentile of where these kicks are, like
right,
he's going to be involved for sure.
Oh yeah.
And
And
it's going to get in kickers' heads, or like maybe there's one of the secondary effects that I was thinking is like you could end up in a scenario where like the typical field goal, then the kickers attempt to use a higher launch angle, and how that would turn out if these kickers are changing some way that they kicked for the last 10 years of their life. Or maybe it ends up in a situation where the holder is now no longer at 8 yards and they have to move to 9 yards.
Right.
And how does that impact the edges? Like if you have players rushing off the edges, and how does that impact the total operation time of the kick? Because it would take longer, and it's like,
right, the further back you are, the more likely to someone off the edge could block it.
Yeah, and then it does allow for even more of a little bit more,
just because the angle is not as not as steep of an angle to get to it.
Yeah, and then it's like for these long snappers that have been doing 8-yard snaps for their entire life, like that's different too. Like it would change things. But either way, in my opinion, the relative risk is near nothing if you're on the team side, and the potential upside is like your 46th player on the team could have a huge impact on winning and losing games, and it would also be hilarious.
I would want to see this, just because I would want to see, like, I'm just imagining in my mind Taco Fall there, like you're playing against like the Lions or something, and then it's like 4th and 2, they're going to kick a field goal, and then Dan Campbell just orders the code red, and they just decide to fake it and have 2 guys just try to destroy Taco. Just try to kill this guy. Just try to like kill this guy, or to see him drop back into coverage or something would just be so awesome. Like that alone would just be so good that it would definitely be adding some excitement to the league.
I thought a little bit about like, okay, what about like a 3-man rush situation on 3rd downs where you have him playing like nose tackle, and he's just like shuffling back and forth, like following the quarterback's eyes, just going for a bat down. Like, because I think that too would, like, I don't necessarily want to like exhaust these guys, particularly if they're like still under contract with the NBA team, or like they're still pursuing that. You don't want to like put them at an at-risk injury situation, but I think that would be kind of funny too, to like,
imagine you could structure the back end of your coverage knowing that the quarterback like can't get the ball to the middle of the field.
No, seriously. It's like, you're telling your like defensive backs, everyone play outside leverage because they can't throw to the inside. Like, so
there's a lot of possibilities here. I like it. I think it has the potential to make some people mad and say that you're ruining the game, which I love, because that's what we're all here for. So NFL coaches, I know you're all listening. I know everyone listens to this podcast. So if you're out there, consult here with at Paganetti, Ryan, and get at him about this, his new theory.
And one thing I'd say is if you're a team, I know like the TrackMan company sells a device that they offer to teams. And the first thing you could do is, get one of these things and, start gathering information on your specific kicker. And, that even like, have tryouts, like maybe you want to have like an emergency list of kickers, like, this this device is so useful and so interesting and so valuable. Like being able to really differentiate between, you know, tryout kickers, this could be incredibly helpful. And, you know, in terms of this potential strategy, like it would be very interesting to see, you know, like, okay, like where are these balls for our kicker? Where are these balls for these tryout kickers? Like maybe at some point you bring in a guy like a Taco Fall, or you convince somebody. Like if I'm Taco Fall, like I'm looking at this like, hey, I might be able to make, you know, like $1-2 million a year. Like I don't even know like what the salary distribution could end up being. Like if it was as easy as you just get a tall guy and like, okay, maybe that it's more of a minimum salary guy, but like if there's certain players that are just particularly good at this because of how big they are, like Taco Fall, like, I want to say is near 300 pounds. Like that helps too in terms of like his girth of like being able to, you know, hold up in there.
Right.
As opposed to some of these like, you know, tall guys are like very light and they're like 220 pounds or something. And like they might get thrown around a little bit by, you know, offensive linemen and things like that. But I just think the relative risk is like near zero. Like you bring some guys in for workouts and then like see what happens.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if it works in practice, I mean, the risk is like it's reported on and you're made fun of, basically. Like that's a big risk.
I mean, like the upside is like you possibly win, you know, 2 more games this year because you blocked kicks over the course of a game or something. And it's like, find it like, and also if you did this and you succeeded as a GM, like you're in the mix for winning GM of the year for like just having this ridiculously innovative strategy. But
I like that every team, like now you need to find 32. Like, what if their salaries start going up? What if you find out these guys are worth like $10 million a year or something?
That's, I mean, I was thinking about this. I'm like, look, you know, if this guy was capable of blocking something like 50% of field goals and extra points or whatever the number is, that's just an obscure estimate. But like, you consider the expected points added and the win probability added over the course of a year. And like,
yeah,
you're talking like, you know, a very high salary that is, you know, maybe 10 times as much as they can get in the NBA. Like,
yeah, because they wouldn't necessarily be like all replaceable either. Like if you had a few guys who could really like get to that,
yes,
you know, median to 75th percentile sort of thing, they'd be worth so much more than the guys who can only get to like the 25th or something like that.
I believe Taco, his standing reach without jumping was something like 5 inches higher than any guy in NBA history that they had at the combine. So like, he's the guy, in my opinion, that I'm most interested in. And I think it's so interesting that, you know, like you have Belichick, who's so pro special teams and thinking outside the box. And Belichick in the past I'm sure he was probably upset, but he was one of the people that was doing the jump over the line of scrimmage.
Yeah.
And that's kind of out now because you can't
touch. You can only do it. You can only do it if you completely clear without touching anybody. Yeah.
So I think it'd be interesting, you know, give Brad Stevens a call and be like, dude, we got to just, you know, have this guy in for a visit and gather some information and see what happens.
All right. Well, let's do it. I'll tag Taco on Twitter when we put this out. I'll do one of those things like where Dan Ozlowski used to like put out some analysis and he'd tag like 15 people on it. So I'll tag freaks, any tall freaks out there slash football coaches. Check this out. But awesome. Hey, more of this. We gave you before a few weeks ago, we gave you 15-20 minutes on quarterback sneaks. Now we're giving you a half an hour on jumping, like really freaks jumping and blocking field goals. This is the stuff people want. This is what the people want. So I'm glad to be able to give it to them. And we will do that now every Tuesday. Ryan will be back on there again. Follow Ryan on Twitter at Paganetti Ryan. We'll try to keep this a crypto free zone also, but we'll see. We may get into that eventually as the season goes along. All right, buddy.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right, man. Everyone else, I'll be talking at you again later this week. We're going to do a solo pod previewing some of the stuff for this weekend, and then we'll continue that format for the rest of the season. But thanks, everyone, for tuning in, and I'll talk to you then.